Father demanded his Amish son choose a bride, and he picked the fat black girl. In a quiet frontier town, under the shadow of the church bell, a son is forced to make the hardest choice of his life. Everyone expects him to marry a plain Amish girl, but he walks into the meeting house holding the hand of an outsider, a woman with a voice that can stir heaven itself, and a past that makes the whole town whisper. The streets fill with dust, railroad men arrive with deeds and threats, and even his own father signs papers against her. She holds more than love in her hands. She holds the land the railroad is desperate to take. Now the town is divided. Faith collides with prejudice. A father's pride battles a son's devotion. Will love be strong enough to survive the fury of family, the pressure of the railroad, and the weight of an entire community? Or will the choice that shocked the town tear everything apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The crisp autumn morning painted the Colorado sky in shades of amber and gold as Levi Miller worked alongside his father in silence. The steady clip-clop of hooves against packed earth, and the gentle jingling of harness bells filled the air while they hitched their buggy for the Sunday meeting. Though only 20 years old, Levi's shoulders already carried the weight of generations of tradition. Ethan Miller stood tall and rigid, his weathered hands checking the leather straps with practiced efficiency. His stern gaze fell heavy on his son. "The time has come, Levi," he said, his voice as unyielding as iron. "You have 1 month to choose a wife. Our ways are clear. A man takes his place in the community through marriage and family." The words struck Levi like physical blows, though he kept his face carefully neutral. The leather reins felt rough against his palms as he adjusted them, buying time before he had to meet his father's eyes. "If you fail to choose," Ethan continued, each word measured and final, "you leave me no choice but excommunication." The ordnung must be upheld. The drive to church stretched long and silent between father and son. Their buggy wheels cut familiar grooves into the dusty road as they passed fields ready for harvest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the land, much like the shadow that had fallen across Levi's heart. The wooden church stood plain and sturdy against the Colorado landscape. As Levi followed his father through the door, the familiar sense of wood polish and well-worn hymnals wrapped around him. But today, the comfort felt hollow. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo his footsteps as he made his way to their usual bench. Throughout the service, Levi felt the weight of knowing. Looks from the community. Young women cast careful glances his way, their mothers watching with hopeful eyes. His father's ultimatum wasn't just about marriage. It was about maintaining the carefully ordered world they'd built here in Greeley. After the final hymn faded, Ethan caught Levi's arm before he could slip away. "Remember, son," he said, voice low but carrying the force of generations. "Faith without obedience is nothing but rebellion against God's ordained order." Levi's throat tightened, but he managed a slight nod. The words felt like chains around his heart, even as something deeper, a quiet certainty he couldn't ignore, told him there was more to faith than blind obedience. The day stretched long, each hour drawing them closer to the evening meal. When supper finally arrived, the Miller family gathered around their solid oak table, the silence broken only by the quiet clink of spoons against bowls. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls as Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll speak plain, Levi," he said, setting down his spoon. "You will marry a proper Amish girl, one who knows our ways and will help maintain our traditions. Or you will leave this community." His words fell like stones into still water. Rippling through the quiet kitchen, Levi's mother kept her eyes on her bowl, while his younger sisters darted uncertain glances between father and son. The tick of the clock on the wall marked each heavy moment. Later that night, Levi lay in his loft bed, staring up at the rough-hewn rafters. Moonlight filtered through the small window, painting silver patterns on the wooden beams. The weight of the day's ultimatum pressed down on him like a physical thing. His father's words echoed in his mind, but alongside them came other thoughts. Of compassion, of a love that reached beyond the boundaries of tradition. Of a God who might care more about the heart than the letter of human laws. The flame of his bedside lantern burned low, casting a warm glow that seemed to mirror the ember of conviction growing in his chest. Levi turned onto his side, clasping his hands together in the darkness. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the night air, "give me the courage to follow your leading, even when the path seems impossible." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Help me honor my father while staying true to what you're asking of me." The lantern's flame flickered, casting long shadows across the loft as Levi's prayer faded into the quiet night. Though his heart felt heavy, something else stirred within him, a determination that ran deeper than fear. A certainty that transcended even the traditions he'd been raised to revere. Morning sunlight spilled across the Colorado plains as Levi guided his wagon toward town. The wooden barrels in back rattled with each bump of the rutted road. His breath frosted in the crisp autumn air while his horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust. The town of Greeley stirred to life around him as he made his deliveries. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm. Levi nodded politely to those he passed, though his mind still churned with yesterday's ultimatum. As he approached the stage, stopped to deliver the last barrel, a sound caught his attention, singing clear and sweet, mixed with children's laughter. The melody floated on the morning air, familiar yet different from any hymn he'd heard in meeting. Levi secured his horse and followed the sound. Around the corner, there, stirring a large pot of stew over an outdoor fire, stood a stout black woman. Her strong hands moved steadily as she worked, her rich voice lifting in praise. 3 children sat on nearby crates, clapping along as she sang. Her face glowed with joy, and her eyes sparkled with kindness. Levi found himself pausing, the barrel forgotten in his arms. The woman's presence seemed to fill the small yard with warmth, despite the morning chill. She wore a simple brown dress and crisp white apron, her hair neatly covered with a cotton kerchief. She looked up, noticing him, and her smile widened. "Good morning to you," she called out. "I'm Samantha Carter, cook for the stage stop." She gestured toward a pot hanging over a smaller fire. "Coffee's fresh, if you've a mind for some." "Much obliged," Levi replied, carefully setting down his barrel. "I'm Levi Miller." He accepted the tin cup she offered, its warmth welcome in his cold hands. "Ah, Jacob Miller's boy," Samantha said, stirring her stew. "I've traded with your father." For vegetables, she hummed a few notes, then added, "The Lord provides good soil for growing. Praise his name." The easy way she spoke of faith caught Levi's attention. "You know the good book?" Samantha's eyes held both wisdom and pain as she nodded. "My former mistress, a Quaker widow, taught me to read from Scripture, left me her land and Bible when she passed." She smiled at the children, who had wandered off to play. "Now I cook for travelers and share what I know with any who'll listen." Though their conversation lasted only minutes more. Something about Samantha's quiet strength and unashamed faith stayed with Levi as he finished his deliveries and headed home. The afternoon found him working alongside his father, mending the south pasture fence. The steady rhythm of hammering posts gave Ethan plenty of opportunity to speak his mind. "Rachel Yoder was asking after you at meeting," Ethan said, measuring the next post spacing. "Good family, the Yoders. Strong in the faith." He paused, watching Levi from the corner of his eye. Sarah Hochstetler would make a fine wife, too. Her mother's bread wins prizes at Harvest Festival. Levi drove another nail, letting the metallic ring fill the silence before answering. "Yes, Father." "Best to stay clear of outsiders," Ethan continued, his voice hardening. "They don't understand our ways. Bring nothing but trouble and heartache to those who stray." The warning was clear, though Levi wondered if his father had somehow sensed his morning encounter. He kept his face carefully neutral as they finished the fence, speaking only when necessary. That night, lying in his familiar loft bed, Levi couldn't shake the memory of Samantha's voice raised in song. The genuine warmth in her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she spoke of her past. The lantern cast shifting shadows on the wall as he considered his father's ultimatum. Marriage should be more than a business arrangement, he thought. More than just maintaining tradition. Shouldn't it grow from genuine connection, shared faith, true understanding? In the gentle glow of his lantern, Levi reached his decision. He would not bow to pressure or allow himself to be forced into a loveless match, no matter the cost. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but his path was set. The lantern flame flickered lower, and Levi watched it dance. Strange peace settled over him, despite knowing the storms that lay ahead. When the light finally died, leaving him in darkness, his resolve remained steady and sure. The following Sunday dawned bright but cold. Frost glittered on the hitching posts outside the wooden church as buggies arrived one by one. Women in plain dresses and white bonnets gathered on one side, while men in dark coats clustered on the other. The morning air hummed with whispered conversations. Levi sat rigid beside his father in their usual pew, feeling the weight of sideways glances. Word of Ethan's ultimatum had spread through the community like wildfire. Several young women cast hopeful looks his way, their mothers nudging them forward after the opening prayer. Near the back of the church, Samantha sat quietly, her brown dress neat and simple, a modest cap covering her hair. She had begun attending services 2 months ago, drawn by the plain faith she saw in some members of the community, though few spoke to her directly. None had turned her away. The service proceeded as usual, prayers, scripture readings, and hymns sung in the old way. Bishop Abram Yoder's sermon spoke of God's unexpected ways of working in the world. Levi's heart thundered in his chest as the final hymn drew to a close. This was the moment he had been preparing for all week. As the congregation began to rise, Levi stood quickly. His legs trembled slightly as he walked purposefully to where Samantha sat. The rustle of movement in the church fell to sudden silence as he extended his hand to her. Samantha looked up at him, surprise and understanding flowing across her face. After a brief pause that felt like eternity, she placed her hand in his. Her palm was warm and steady against his trembling fingers. Together they walked to the front of the church. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the stunned quiet. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation as understanding dawned. Levi could feel his father's burning gaze, but he kept his eyes forward, drawing himself to his full height. Levi spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the church. "This is the woman I will marry." The silence shattered. Whispers erupted like startled birds. Someone dropped a hymnal. Ethan Miller's face darkened like an approaching storm, and he took a step forward, mouth opening to speak. But Bishop Yoder raised his hand, commanding silence with a simple gesture. His weathered face was thoughtful as he studied the couple. Before him, after a long moment, he turned to Samantha. "Sister," he said gently, "would you share a hymn with us?" Samantha squeezed Levi's hand once before releasing it. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. Her voice, rich and clear, filled the church with an old hymn of grace and redemption. The melody was familiar, but she brought something new to it. Echoes of suffering, of joy, of faith tested and proved true. Several of the older women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even some of the men looked down, moved by the pure devotion in her voice. For a precious moment, judgment gave way to something softer, something that felt like possibility. The last note faded into silence. No one moved for several heartbeats. Then the spell broke, and the whispers began again as people filed out of the church. Some faces showed confusion, others disapproval, and a few, mostly among the younger folk, showed something like admiration in the buggy yard. Families gathered in small clusters, heads bent in urgent discussion. Ethan walked stiffly too. Their buggy, putting as much distance between himself and his son as possible. His jaw was clenched so tight that a muscle twitched visibly. The ride home passed in icy silence. Even the horse seemed to sense the tension, its hooves striking the perfs, striking the packed earth with unusual force. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, with father and son working at opposite ends of the farm. As evening settled over the land, the family gathered around the supper table as they always did. The food grew cold as Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You have shamed our name," he said, staring at his son across the table. "Made mockery of our ways before the entire community." The lantern flame reflected in his eyes, making them blaze with barely contained fury. Levi met his father's gaze steadily. Though his heart ached at the distance between them, his voice remained firm and clear. "I chose love, not fear," he replied. Simply, the lantern light caught the flash of rage in Ethan's eyes, and his hand clenched around his water glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. The days following, Levi's declaration crawled by like molasses in winter. Morning frost gave way to afternoon sun, but the chill between father and son remained. At church, some families hurried past the Millers, averting their eyes as if discord might be catching. Others, mostly younger folk, offered Levi quiet nods of respect when their elders weren't looking. Samantha kept to her routine at the stage stop, though her hands trembled slightly when certain townsfolk turned their backs or whispered behind raised palms. Still, she held her head high, greeting each person with the same warm smile. The scent of fresh bread and stewed apples drifted from her kitchen, drawing hungry travelers who cared more for a good meal than town gossip. Levi found reasons to ride into town more often than usual. One morning, he noticed Samantha's woodpile running low. Without a word, he unhitched his horse and spent the afternoon splitting logs. The steady thunk of his axe drew curious glances from passersby. "You don't have to do this," Samantha said, bringing him a cup of water. Levi paused, wiping his brow. "I reckon I want to." The next week, he spotted her struggling with a broken fence post. That afternoon found him digging post holes and stretching wire. As they worked side by side, Samantha shared stories of her past. "The widow Johnston took me in when I was just 16, she said, holding a post steady while Levi tamped earth around its base. "She taught me letters, hymns, and how to run a proper kitchen. When she passed, she left me this land and her mother's Bible." Her voice softened. "She showed me that faith isn't about rules, it's about love." Levi nodded, thinking of his own struggles. "That's what I've been trying to tell Father. Our ways are good, but sometimes I think we forget why we have them. We get so caught up in being separate that we forget about being kind." One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samantha invited Levi to supper at her small cabin. The table was set simple, but neat, with 2 tin plates and a blue checkered cloth. Steam rose from a pot of beans seasoned with ham hock, and the cornbread came out of the oven golden brown. Levi found himself relaxing as they talked and shared the meal. Samantha's laugh was free and easy, filling the cabin with warmth. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders lost their tension. Here, there were no judgmental eyes or whispered comments, just good food and honest conversation. Meanwhile, in town, Ethan Miller sat in the council chamber with several other community leaders. Railroad surveyors had arrived the previous week, mapping the proposed route for the new line. Their drawings showed the tracks cutting directly through Samantha's property. "It's a sign," Ethan said firmly, his finger tracing the survey line. "If we can convince her to sell now, before the railroad makes their offer." He left the thought unfinished, but the other men nodded in understanding. Some shared his concern about Levi's choice, viewing it as a threat to their communities. Way of life. That evening, Ethan knelt beside his bed as crickets chirped outside his window. "Lord," he whispered, "grant me wisdom to protect my son." In his heart, he truly believed he was doing right, saving Levi from making a terrible mistake. The fact that his actions might harm Samantha didn't enter his prayers. Unaware of the schemes being laid, Levi and Samantha walked beneath a sky scattered with stars. The evening air was cool, but not cold, carrying the scent of late summer flowers. Their hands brushed occasionally as they walked, neither pulling away when it happened. "One there is the North Star," Levi said, pointing upward. "Pa taught me how to find it when I was young." Samantha smiled, her face gentle in the starlight. "My grandmother used to say it was God's lamp, lighting the way home for lost souls." Their fingers intertwined properly then, both pretending it happened by accident. They walked in comfortable silence, their shadows merging in the moonlight. Love was growing between them, quiet and steady as a deep river. Despite all the obstacles in their path, neither noticed the lantern still burning in the council chamber, where maps lay spread across the table, marking the place where their world was about to change. A week passed, bringing with it the first hints of autumn. Crisp morning air carried the scent of ripening apples as Levi guided his buggy down the dusty lane to the Yoder farm. Beside him, Samantha sat straight-backed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers twisted nervously in the fabric of her dark blue dress. "The Yoders have 6 little ones," Levi explained, stealing a glance at her profile. "Mary, their oldest, has been asking about your singing since she heard you at meeting." Samantha nodded, her smile warming. Children have open hearts. They hear the spirit in the music, not just the words. The Yoder children spilled out of their farmhouse like puppies when the buggy pulled up, their bare feet kicking up dust. Their mother Rachel followed more slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes held caution, but she managed a polite nod. "Welcome," she said, ushering everyone into the shade of the big maple tree in the yard. Samantha settled onto a wooden bench, and the children gathered around her like moths to a flame. Even the shyest one, little Samuel, crept closer when she began to hum. Her voice started soft, introducing a rhythm that seemed to dance on the air. Then she added words, familiar hymn verses wrapped in new, captivating patterns. "It's called Call and Response," she explained to the wide-eyed children. "One voice leads, then everyone answers, like birds singing to each other across the fields." Soon, young voices joined hers, stumbling at first, then growing confident. The ancient melody wove together with the African rhythms, creating something both strange and beautiful. More women drifted over from neighboring farms, drawn by the sound. Their faces showed uncertainty at first, but as their own children's. Voices rose in joy. Their expressions softened. Rachel Yoder's foot began tapping despite herself. When Samantha noticed, she smiled warmly and nodded encouragement. By the third verse, several mothers were humming along, their harmony as natural as breathing. The peaceful moment shattered that evening when Levi returned home. Ethan stood waiting. In the barn, his face dark as a thundercloud. "You took that woman to the Yoders," he said, each word sharp as hailstones. "Her name is Samantha," Levi replied quietly, continuing to unhitch the horse. "She's changing our ways, corrupting our children with her foreign songs. Next thing you know, she'll have them. She sings for the same Lord we do." Levi cut in, his voice firm but respectful. The children heard his spirit in the music. Isn't that what matters? Ethan's jaw clenched. He turned and strode away, leaving words unspoken but anger hanging thick in the air. Levi finished his chores in silence, each movement carefully controlled. Despite the storm in his heart, when Saturday arrived, the whole community gathered for the Hochstetler barn raising. Samantha came with Levi, wearing her best dress and carrying baskets of fresh bread and apple butter. Some folks still turned away when she approached, but others remembered the singing children and offered small smiles. She threw herself into the work, serving food, fetching water, and watching over little ones while their parents helped with construction. Her laugh rang out often, encouraging both workers and children alike. The frame of the barn rose steadily through the morning. Just after noon, as men positioned a heavy support beam, someone called out an alarm. The rope slipped, the beam tipped. An 8-year-old Jacob Hochstetler stood frozen directly beneath. Samantha moved without thinking. She lunged forward, shoving the boy clear, even as the beam caught her shoulder. She went down hard, crying out as she hit the dirt. For a moment, everything stopped. Then Jacob's mother screamed, running to gather her son. Others rushed to lift the beam off Samantha. Levi reached her first, heart in his throat, but she was already trying to sit up. "I'm all right," she insisted, though her face was pale with pain. "Just bruised, I reckon. Is the boy safe?" Jacob himself answered by throwing his arms around her neck, sobbing "thank you" over and over. His mother joined him, tears streaming down her face as she gripped Samantha's hand. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. He had seen everything: Samantha's instant response, her concern for the child before herself. Something shifted behind his eyes, though he said nothing. As the sun set and families began heading home, word of Samantha's actions spread through the community. Women who had avoided her now stopped to thank her. Men nodded respectfully as they passed. Even the bishop paused to lay a gentle hand on her shoulder, the one not wrapped in a makeshift sling. "Greater love hath no man than this," he quoted softly, "that he lay down his life for his friends." The evening air hummed with conversation as buggies rolled homeward. Did you see how fast she moved? Not a thought for herself, perhaps. The Lord sent her to us after all. The days following the barn raising brought unexpected warmth to Samantha's door. The steady clip-clop of buggy wheels marked frequent visitors, each bearing gifts and hesitant smiles. Sarah Hochstetler arrived first, carrying a still-warm shoe-fly pie and tears of gratitude for her son's life. Rachel Yoder brought fresh bread and butter, asking quietly if Samantha might teach her children another hymn once her shoulder healed. Levi spent every free moment at the cabin, his strong hands taking over the heavier chores. One golden afternoon, as they sat on her porch watching sunset paint the hills, he spoke of their future. "I thought we might build right here," he said, gesturing to a flat stretch near her garden. "A proper house, with room for little ones someday." His voice held such certainty, such hope. Samantha's heart swelled at his words. But before she could respond, dust rose on the road. 3 men on horseback approached, their citified clothes marking them as strangers. The lead rider, a sharp-featured man in a black coat, dismounted with a swagger that set Levi's jaw tight. "Miss Carter." The man pulled papers from his satchel. "I represent the Western Pacific Railroad. There seems to be an irregularity with your property deed." Samantha stood slowly, her injured shoulder forgotten. "My papers are proper and legal. Miss Rebecca Thornton left me this land in her will, witnessed and signed." "Ah, but you see," the man's smile never reached his eyes. "We have documentation showing Miss Thornton's own claim was never properly registered. The railroad survey puts our rights-of-way straight through this." He glanced dismissively at her cabin, establishment. "That's nonsense." Levi stepped forward. "The Quakers have lived here 20 years. The second man's hand drifted to his gun belt. "Best mind your own business, boy. This doesn't concern you. I suggest you vacate within the week," the leader continued smoothly. "We're prepared to be generous with compensation, considering your situation." The way he said situation made Samantha's skin crawl. "And if I refuse?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. The third man spat tobacco juice near her flowers. "Accidents happen, woman, especially to folks who don't know their place." Levi's muscles coiled like a spring, but Samantha touched his arm. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I'll have my lawyer review your papers." They rode away, laughing. As soon as they were out of sight, Levi grabbed his hat. "I'm getting father. He's on the town council. They'll have to listen to him." Samantha watched him go, worry gnawing at her heart. She retrieved her deed from the trunk beneath her bed, tracing Miss Rebecca's signature with gentle fingers. Levi found Ethan in their barn, mending harness. "Father, please. The railroad men threatened Samantha. They're trying to steal her land." Ethan's hand stilled on the leather. "Perhaps it's God's way of setting things right." "What do you mean?" "I've already spoken with them." Ethan's voice was cold. "They asked if I knew anything about the property's history. I told them Miss Thornton was addled near the end, barely knowing what she signed." The betrayal hit Levi like a physical blow. "You're lying to help them steal her home?" "I'm trying to save you," Ethan shouted, throwing down the harness. "This infatuation will destroy everything, your place in the community, your eternal soul." "My soul." Levi's quiet voice shook with fury.
No.
"You speak of souls while bearing false witness, while helping thieves rob a widow. She's not one of us, Levi. She never will be. This is God's mercy, showing you the truth before it's too late. No." Levi stepped close to his father, meeting his eyes. "This is your pride, not God's will. My love for Samantha is true and unshakable. Nothing you do will change that." "Then it's rebellion," Ethan spat. "Against your family, against the Ordnung, against God himself. The only rebellion here is against love." Levi turned away, his heart breaking. "And that rebellion is yours, Father. Father." He strode out into the gathering dusk, leaving Ethan alone with his bitter righteousness. The evening star rose as Levi walked the mile to Samantha's cabin. He found her on the porch steps, deed clutched in her hands, singing softly into the darkness. Her voice wavered on the old spiritual. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus." The words hung in the night air like a prayer, or perhaps a plea. As shadows deepened around her little home, dawn broke cold and gray over Greeley. Samantha was already awake, having spent most of the night in prayer. The sharp rap of knuckles on her cabin door made her jump. Through the window, she spotted two sheriff's deputies, their badges glinting dully in the early light. Miss Carter. The older deputy held out an official-looking document. "You're hereby summoned to appear before Judge Whitmore on charges of deed fraud and falsification of property claims." Samantha's hands trembled as she accepted the writ, but her voice remained steady. "I understand. When must I appear?" "Today, 10 o'clock sharp." The younger deputy, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Best not be late, ma'am." They rode away. Whispers and pointing began from the handful of townspeople passing by. Mrs. Henderson, who'd smiled at her just yesterday, hurried past with averted eyes. Old Mr. Peters stood in front of the general store, shaking his head and muttering to his cronies. Knew it couldn't be right, her having that fine piece of land. Always seemed too good to be true. Poor Levi Miller. Getting mixed up with such. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the gossip. Levi appeared on his bay horse's face, etched with concern. "I heard from Jacob Yoder. Are you all right?" Samantha handed him the writ, her composure finally cracking. They're saying I forged Miss Rebecca's signature. That I stole the land, somehow. Levi read quickly, his jaw tightening. We'll fight this. I'll hitch up your wagon. We're going together. While Samantha changed into her best dress, the navy blue one Miss Rebecca had given her, Levi prepared the wagon. As they set out, he rode beside her, close enough to reach across and squeeze her hand when needed. The courthouse loomed ahead, its brick facade stern and imposing. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with spectators. Samantha felt the weight of their stares as she walked down the aisle. The railroad company's lawyer sat at one table, surrounded by papers and smirking assistants. To her surprise, she saw Ethan Miller sitting behind them, his face like stone. Judge Whitmore entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat. He peered at the assembled crowd over his spectacles, then focused on the documents before him. Having reviewed the initial filing, he announced, "I find insufficient evidence to proceed immediately. This hearing will be postponed for 1 week, during which time both parties may gather their proof." He fixed the railroad lawyer with a stern look. "I expect to see the original survey documents and title challenges, not just allegations." The lawyer stood smoothly. "Your Honor, given the serious nature of the fraud charges, we request the defendant be removed from the disputed property pending trial." Objection. Samantha surprised herself by standing. "Your Honor, that cabin is my only home." Judge Whitmore considered for a long moment. "The defendant may remain in residence until trial, but is forbidden from making any alterations or improvements to the property. Next Friday, 10 o'clock. His gavel cracked sharply. The ride home was silent. Samantha held herself rigid until they reached her cabin, then crumpled against Levi's chest as soon as they were inside. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "How can they do this?" she whispered. "Miss Rebecca was like a mother to me. She taught me to read with that very Bible." She pointed to the worn volume on her shelf. "Now they say I betrayed her trust." Levi held her close, his heart aching. "We'll prove the truth. God knows what's right." The sun was setting when he finally headed home, promising to return in the morning. He found Ethan waiting in the barn, face shadowed in the dying light. "The elders have spoken," Ethan said without preamble. "You are shunned until you renounce this foolishness and return to the faith." Levi felt the weight of the words like physical blows. Shunning meant no Amish person would eat with him, speak to him, or acknowledge his presence. Even his father would turn his back. "I understand," he said quietly. "Do you?" Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "You'll lose everything, your family, your community, your inheritance." "No, Father, I'll lose things, but not everything. I'm keeping my faith in God's love, keeping my honor, and I'm keeping my promise to stand with an innocent woman against injustice." Ethan turned away, shoulders stiff. "Then go." Levi walked out of his childhood home for what might be the last time. The evening star guided his steps to Samantha's cabin, where lamplight glowed in welcome. Inside, she had set out fresh bread and her last jar of preserves. They sat together at her small table, heads bowed in prayer. Samantha's voice was soft but unwavering as she asked for strength, for justice, and for the hearts of their opponents to be turned toward truth. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows on the wall as they shared the simple meal, finding comfort in each other's presence as they prepared for the trial that would decide their future. The week before the trial stretched long and heavy, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Each morning, Levi arrived at Samantha's cabin. As the sun rose, determined to make her home secure against the coming autumn weather. The old roof had begun to leak, and though the judge's order prevented improvements, repairs couldn't wait. From his perch on the roof, Levi could see townsfolk passing by, their whispers carrying on the breeze. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, while others hurried past with downcast eyes. Mrs. Baker, who'd once praised Samantha's cornbread, now hustled her children to the other side of the road. "Don't pay them any mind," Levi called down to Samantha, who stood steadfast below, holding the ladder. "The roof's looking better already." Samantha nodded, adjusting her apron. "The Lord sees what's true," she said, then smiled as young Timothy Watson and his sister Sarah crept around the corner of the cabin. Despite their mother's warnings, the children still came for their Bible lessons. "Miss Carter," Sarah asked, shyly, "can we still learn today?" "Of course, child." Samantha guided them to the shelter of her wide porch, where she'd set up a small bench. More children appeared, drawn by her warmth and the promise of stories. Soon, her clear voice rang out, teaching scripture with patience and joy. "Love your neighbor as yourself," she read, her finger tracing the words in her worn Bible. "Now, who can tell me what that means?" Timothy's hand shot up. "It means being kind to everyone, even if they're different from you." Samantha's eyes glistened. "That's right, Timothy. That's exactly right." The autumn wind picked up as evening approached, carrying the scent of rain. Levi had just finished the last section of roofing when he spotted a familiar figure approaching. His father's tall form cast a long shadow in the setting sun. Ethan Miller stood at the base of the ladder, his face etched with both sternness and sorrow. "Son," he called up, "we must speak." Levi climbed down slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. Samantha watched from the porch, her hands clasped tightly together. "Come away from here," Ethan pleaded, his voice lower than usual. "There's still time to prevent complete ruin. The community will forgive you if you return now. Renounce this foolishness." The wind rustled through the trees as Levi faced his father. In the fading light, their shadows stretched like two trees grown from the same root, now splitting apart. "Is love foolishness, Father?" Levi's voice was quiet but firm. "Is following one's heart and conscience against tradition such a sin?" "You risk everything." Ethan's control cracked slightly. "Your place in the community, your inheritance, your very soul. And for what?" Levi glanced at Samantha, who stood straight and dignified despite her trembling hands. His heart swelled with certainty. "If ruin is the price of love," he declared, meeting his father's gaze steadily, "then I pay it gladly." Ethan's face hardened, though his eyes betrayed his pain. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with unspoken grief. That night, as clouds gathered thick overhead, Samantha tossed in her bed, her dreams filled with memories. Miss Rebecca, the Quaker widow who had given her both freedom and home, appeared as clearly as if she stood in the room. "Child," Dream Rebecca said, her kind face wrinkled with wisdom, "remember what I taught you. Love is the strongest fence. No matter what storms come, love will hold firm." Samantha woke with tears on her cheeks, but peace in her heart. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Lightning flickered through the windows as she lit a lamp. A soft knock came at the door. Levi, checking on her after the confrontation with his father. Together, they knelt beside her rocking chair, their hands clasped in prayer. The storm's fury increased, rain lashing against the newly repaired roof. Yet inside, in the lamp's warm glow, Samantha and Levi found strength in their shared faith. Their whispered prayers rose above the thunder, asking not for easy victory, but for courage to face whatever came. Water soaked the thirsty earth outside, while inside, love and faith held firm against the gathering dark. The roof, mended by careful hands, kept them dry, a small victory against the elements. A symbol of their determination to weather any storm together. Dawn crept over Greeley with sullen gray clouds that matched the weight in Samantha's heart. She stood before her mirror, pinning her best brooch to her collar with trembling fingers. The small golden cross had been Miss Rebecca's final gift. and today it felt like armor. The courthouse loomed ahead as Levi helped her down from his buggy. Already, townsfolk clustered on the wooden steps, their whispers rising like autumn leaves in the wind. Some nodded respectfully, while others turned away. Samantha gripped her worn leather Bible, which held her precious deed between its pages. Inside, the courtroom's heavy air smelled of dust and polish. Judge Whitmore sat stern-faced. Behind his massive oak desk, his spectacles catching the weak light from rain-streaked windows. Railroad men in sharp suits filled the front row, their confidence evident in their easy smiles. Ethan Miller sat apart, his plain black coat stark against the varnished bench. His eyes met Levi's briefly, then dropped away. When called to testify, he spoke in a low, steady voice about property lines and community concerns. Though he never looked directly at Samantha, his words fell like stones. The land was never properly transferred. Our community needs stability, Your Honor. Clear boundaries. Samantha's throat tightened as she listened. Levi's hand found hers. Beneath the table, warm and steady. When her turn came, Samantha approached the judge's bench. Her deed, yellowed and creased from frequent handling, trembled in her grasp. Miss Rebecca Whitaker granted me this land, she said, her voice gaining strength. She took me in when I had nothing, taught me to read using this very Bible. Before she passed, she made sure I would have a home. Judge Whitmore frowned, examining the document through his spectacles. This deed shows signs of age, but we need more substantial proof of its legitimacy. The railroad's claim a commotion at the back of the courtroom interrupted him. Heads turned as a tall man in a travel-stained coat strode forward, his boots leaving muddy prints on the polished floor. Begging the court's pardon, he announced, removing his hat. I'm Jonathan Hayes, formerly legal counsel to Rebecca Whitaker. He pulled a leather portfolio from his satchel. I've ridden 3 days to bring these documents, having heard of this proceeding. The courthouse hummed with whispers as Hayes presented a sealed envelope to Judge Whitmore. Miss Whitaker's official testament, he explained, signed, and witnessed, confirming her intent to grant this land to Samantha Carter, along with all legal documentation of the transfer. Samantha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling. In her eyes, Levi squeezed her shoulder gently. Judge Whitmore studied the papers intently, his frown deepening. After several long moments, he looked up. These documents require thorough examination. I will need time to review testimonies and consult legal precedents. His gavel cracked against wood. This court will reconvene in 3 days' time for my verdict. The crowd erupted in murmurs as people filed out. Samantha's legs buckled as she reached the courthouse steps. Levi caught her arm, supporting her weight. God has not abandoned us, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. See? How he sent help just when we needed it most. Samantha nodded, unable to speak through her tears of relief and exhaustion. That evening, as shadows lengthened across her cabin's porch, an unexpected procession began. Mrs. Baker arrived first, carrying a steaming chicken pie. For strength, she said simply, patting Samantha's hand. More neighbors followed. Old Wilhelm brought fresh churned butter. The Watson children came with their mother, bearing preserved peaches and shy smiles. Even Widow Schmidt, who had once crossed the street to avoid Samantha, brought warm bread and muttered words of encouragement. We've been watching, Mrs. Baker admitted, as women arranged food on Samantha's small table. Seeing how you teach the children, how you work without complaint, how you face trouble with dignity. She glanced at the others. Perhaps we were too quick to judge. Levi watched from the doorway as Samantha welcomed each visitor, her grace touching hearts that had been closed against her. The cabin filled with warmth and quiet conversation, the aroma of good food replacing the day's tension as twilight settled. Lanterns glowed in Samantha's windows like beacons of hope. Inside, former strangers shared bread and fellowship, while outside, the gray clouds finally parted, revealing stars that sparkled like promises in the darkening sky. In the quiet days that followed the trial's postponement, something shifted in Greeley like winter ice beginning to thaw. Women who had watched Samantha from afar now gathered in twos and threes, speaking in low voices about what they had witnessed over recent months. Mrs. Baker hosted them first in her kitchen, steam rising from copper kettles as she poured tea. "Remember the barn raising?" she asked, settling into her chair. "I saw how she threw herself forward to protect young Timothy Watson. Didn't think twice about her own safety. My Sarah still sings those hymns Samantha taught her," Martha Wilson added, warming her hands around her cup. "Never heard such joy in worship before." The women nodded, remembering how Samantha's voice had filled the church that first Sunday, rich and pure as spring water. Even those who had doubted her couldn't deny the spirit in her song. As afternoon lights slanted through lace curtains, they made their decision. One by one, they would speak at the next court session, sharing what they had seen of Samantha's character. It wasn't the usual way women speaking in court, but these weren't usual times. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Miller's barn echoed with his restless footsteps. Night after night, he paced between the stalls, his lantern casting strange shadows. On weathered walls, pride and certainty had once steadied his steps like a staff, but now doubt gnawed at him like a winter-hungry rat. He remembered Samantha's face as she shielded Timothy, her arms wrapping around the boy as the heavy beam crashed down. The same selfless courage he had always admired in his own people. His hand touched the rough barn wall, seeking support as memories warred with tradition. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Samantha stood before her mirror, straightening her plain brown dress, gathering courage like kindling. When she arrived at the meeting house, Levi waiting beside his buggy. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. Some turned their backs as she passed, a wall of plain coats and bonnets. But others, led by Mrs. Baker, stepped forward with quiet greetings. "Good morning, Samantha," they said, their voices soft but clear. Each word felt like a small light in darkness. Inside, beneath rough-hewn beams, the congregation settled into familiar rhythms of prayer and song. When it came time for scripture reading, Levi stood, his Bible open in steady hands. His voice filled the hushed room, strong and certain. "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." The words seemed to hang in the air like morning mist, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Some shifted uncomfortably on hard benches. Others sat straighter, touched by truth. Ethan remained still as stone, but his hands gripped his knees until knuckles showed white. Evening found Samantha on her cabin porch, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Levi sat beside her, the wooden steps creaking softly. Beneath his weight, inside, a lamp cast warm light through curtained windows. If Samantha's voice caught, she tried again, stronger. "If the verdict goes against me, I'll leave Greeley." Her hands twisted in her lap like worried birds. "I won't have you lose everything for my sake. Your family, your community, Samantha." Levi turned to face her, his eyes steady as stars. "Where you go, I go. That's not a choice any more than breathing is a choice." He took her work-roughened hands in his. "You are my family now." Lamplight spilled across their clasped hands, catching the small golden cross at Samantha's throat. Inside, the cabin waited, warm and welcoming, sheltering their hopes like seeds planted in fertile soil. Outside, crickets sang their evening prayers, and somewhere in the distance, a whip-poor-will called to its mate, sure of answer. They sat together as darkness gathered, their hearts beating in time, united against whatever storms might come. In that moment, fear seemed as insubstantial as shadows fleeing before dawn's light. Powerless against the stronger force of love, Mrs. Baker and the other women were already planning their testimonies for court, their quiet determination spreading through the community like ripples in still water. Each small act of kindness, each word of support, built bridges across the chasms of prejudice and doubt. The love between Levi and Samantha had become a pebble dropped in quiet waters, sending out circles of change that touched hearts one by one, proving that courage, like grace, could transform even the most unyielding soil into fertile ground for hope. The courthouse buzzed like a disturbed beehive as townsfolk pressed through its doors on that crisp autumn morning. Every bench creaked under the weight of bodies, and those who couldn't find seats lined the walls, their faces expectant. Samantha sat straight-backed beside Levi, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. Mrs. Baker was the first to testify. She rose from her seat, smoothing her plain dress, and spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner. "I've watched Miss Carter with our children," she said, meeting the judge's stern gaze. "She teaches them not just songs, but kindness. When my Sarah was sick with fever, Miss Carter brought healing tea and sat up all night, singing hymns until the worst passed." One by one, other mothers stepped forward. Martha Wilson described how Samantha had taught her daughters to read, using Bible verses. Emma Thompson recalled the day Samantha had mended her son's torn jacket, refusing payment and instead teaching him to sew the next tier himself. Little Timothy Watson, the boy Samantha had saved at the barn raising, shuffled to the front when called. His mother's encouraging hand on his shoulder, he spoke in a small but steady voice. "Miss Samantha pushed me away from the falling beam," he said, fingers twisting his cap. "She got hurt instead of me. And she still smiled and told me not to worry." Other children followed, some barely tall enough to see over the witness rail. They spoke of warm cornbread shared on cold days, of Bible stories told with voices for each character, of gentle hands guiding theirs through letters and numbers. The Quaker widow's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, presented his evidence with methodical care. He spread documents across the judge's desk, the original deed, witnessed and sealed, the widow's testament, her signature clear and bold, letters speaking of her intent to leave her property to my dear Samantha, whose faith and kindness have brightened my final years. Railroad men shifted restlessly in their seats as each new witness strengthened Samantha's claim. Their lawyer's face grew darker, like storm clouds gathering. When he rose to speak, his voice crackled with barely contained anger. "We will appeal to Denver," he declared, slapping his hand on the rail. "To the territorial court, if necessary. This land is vital to progress, and we won't let it be held hostage by that will do." Counselor Judge Whitmore cut in, his tone sharp as winter wind. He surveyed the crowded courtroom, his expression unreadable beneath his thick gray brows. "I have heard sufficient testimony. I will consider all evidence presented and deliver my ruling in 3 days' time. This court is adjourned." The crack echoed like thunder through the hushed room. Outside, autumn twilight painted the sky in deep purples and golds. Samantha and Levi walked home slowly, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. Neither spoke much. The day's emotions lay too deep for words. Their joined hands said everything necessary. From the shadow of his barn, Ethan Miller watched them pass, his son straight back, his gentle way of helping Samantha over rough patches in the path. The quiet dignity they shared it all pressed against his heart like a weight. The railroad men's threats echoed in his mind, along with the children's simple testimonies and the mother's steady voices speaking truth. After they disappeared around the bend, Ethan entered his barn. The familiar smells of hay and leather couldn't comfort him tonight. For the first time in years, his certainty had crumbled like dry earth in drought. He sank to his knees in the empty barn, straw crackling beneath him. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears, "I have been proud. I thought I knew your will better than these others, better than my own son." His hands clasped tight enough to whiten knuckles. "Show me mercy, Lord. Show me how to make this right." The barn's darkness wrapped around him like a shroud as he knelt there, pride finally breaking under the weight of truth. A mile away. Samantha climbed her cabin steps, Levi's hand steady at her elbow. Through her window, she could see the first stars pricking through the darkening sky. She struck a match, its brief flare bright as hope, and touched it to her lamp's wick. The lamp's glow spread like ripples on still water, warming the cabin's weathered walls. Its light reached out through the window, a beacon against the gathering night, as if declaring that here, in this small space, love had made its stand. Samantha adjusted the flame, her movements sure and peaceful, despite the uncertainty still ahead. The light caught the small cross at her throat, making it shine like a star fallen to earth. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not through force, but through the quiet power of love and truth spoken. Dawn broke over. Greeley, in ribbons of gold and pink, painting the courthouse steps where people already gathered. Men in plain coats and women in bonnets stood shoulder to shoulder with townspeople in their finery, all waiting for the doors to open. Inside the packed courtroom, the wood benches groaned under the weight of so many bodies. Samantha sat rigid. In her seat, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of her best dress. Levi's steady presence beside her kept her grounded as Judge Whitmore entered. His black robes sweeping behind him, the room fell silent as death. Even the usual creak of floorboards stilled as the judge settled behind his desk, arranging papers. With deliberate care, his weathered face betrayed nothing as he looked out over the assembled crowd. In the matter of Carter versus the Western Rail Company, Judge Whitmore began, his voice filling every corner of the hushed room. This court has carefully considered all evidence presented. The deed held by Miss Samantha Carter, granted to her by the late Mrs. Rebecca Thompson, has been thoroughly authenticated. The witness testimonies regarding Miss Carter's character and her rightful claim to the property are substantial and compelling. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. Railroad. Men leaned forward, faces taut with anticipation. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Samantha Carter's deed is lawful and binding. Her ownership of the property in question is hereby affirmed without qualification. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Samantha's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Levi's arm went around her shoulders, strong and sure. The judge raised his voice over the growing murmur. Furthermore, should the Western Rail Company wish to lay track through Miss Carter's property, they must negotiate fair payment for right-of-way directly with her, at no less than current market value. The courtroom erupted. Children bounced. In their seats, women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and several men thumped Levi on the back. A few railroad men stormed out, boots thundering on the floorboards. Their lawyer gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. Samantha turned to Levi, her face shining with tears and joy. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close as she wept against his shoulder. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. As people began filing out into the morning sunshine, a hush fell over those nearest the door. Ethan Miller stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his tall frame casting a long shadow. His face was deeply lined, as if he had aged years in days. The crowd parted like water as Samantha and Levi emerged. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across the space between them. Then Ethan took one step forward, then another, his movements stiff as if each step cost him dearly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I was wrong," he said, the words seeming to scrape his throat raw. "Wrong about you, Miss Carter. Wrong about many things." His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Pride, blinded me. I thought I was protecting our ways, but I was only protecting my own stubborn heart. Levi's grip on Samantha's hand tightened. Love is stronger than fear, Father, he said gently. That's what Samantha taught me. Ethan nodded, tears gleaming in his eyes. Perhaps she can teach me too. The evening found Samantha's cabin, glowing with lamplight and life. Neighbors crowded around her table, passing bowls of steaming stew and fresh-baked bread. Children sprawled on the floor with full bellies, and women chatted in corners, their laughter mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. Martha Wilson had brought her famous apple pie. Emma Thompson contributed a jar of preserved peaches. Even Mrs. Baker was there, her stern face softened by the warmth of fellowship. They had all come, bringing food and friendship, transforming the simple cabin into a place of celebration. As night deepened outside, voices joined in song. Samantha led them in hymns, her rich voice weaving together English verses and African rhythms. The children clapped along, and even some of the men hummed quietly. The music filled every corner of the cabin, spilling out into the dark like a promise of better days. Levi watched Samantha move among her guests, joy radiating from her like sunlight. When she passed near his chair, he caught her hand, drawing her close. "We must wed soon," he whispered, his eyes full of tenderness. "I can't bear to be apart from you another day. Another day." Samantha's smile trembled, tears glistening in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. The lamplight caught the silver cross at her throat, making it shine like a star of hope, a symbol of love's triumph over fear and prejudice. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the meadow as people gathered for the wedding. Dew still sparkled on the grass, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of late summer wildflowers. The simple altar, built from rough-hewn boards by Levi's own hands, stood beneath a spreading oak tree, its weathered wood catching the early light. Children darted between the gathering crowds, their arms full of prairie flowers. They scattered petals along the path where Samantha would walk, giggling as they worked. Women in plain dresses and white caps arranged benches in neat rows, while men in dark suits spoke in hushed tones. Levi stood near the altar, his plain black suit crisp and new. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. Bishop Abram Yoder stood beside him, Bible held carefully in aged hands, a gentle smile beneath his gray beard. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Samantha appeared at the path's end. Her dress was simple cotton, cream-colored and modest, but she wore it like a queen's gown. A wreath of wildflowers crowned her head, and her eyes shone with joy as she walked forward. Some faces in the crowd still showed uncertainty, but many more beamed with genuine welcome. Levi stepped forward to take her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. Together they stood before the altar while Bishop Yoder opened his Bible. The morning light filtered through the oak leaves above them, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, the bishop read, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. Then he stepped aside, nodding to Samantha. She took a deep breath and began to sing. Her voice, though trembling at first, grew stronger with each note. The hymn rose pure and clear, an old song of praise that bridged worlds. Then other voices joined in, first the children, then the women, and finally the men. The harmonies blended African rhythms with Amish plainsong, creating something new and beautiful. When the last note faded, Bishop Yoder led them through their vows. Levi's voice was steady as he promised to love and cherish. Tears rolled down Samantha's cheeks as she spoke her own promises, but her words rang true and clear. At the edge of the gathering, Ethan Miller stood alone, his face a storm of emotions. As the bishop pronounced the final blessing, something in Ethan's rigid posture softened. He stepped forward, removing his broad-brimmed hat and placing it carefully on the ground, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than words. Levi kissed his bride. Gentle and sweet, and the crowd burst into soft applause. Even those who had come with doubts found themselves smiling at the joy radiating from the newlyweds' faces as evening approached. Lanterns were lit around tables laden with food. The wedding feast brought together plain folk and townspeople, sharing bread and pie, stories and laughter. Children played tag between the tables while their elders talked and ate. Samantha moved among her guests, now family, her face glowing. With happiness, Levi never strayed far from her side, their hands finding each other again and again as stars began to appear in the darkening. Autumn painted the prairie in rich golds and browns as Samantha and Levi's new farmhouse took shape. The railroad payment had bought fine timber and skilled hands to help raise the walls. Each morning, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as the house grew larger. Its windows catching the sunrise like jewels, the wide front porch welcomed visitors with comfortable benches and climbing morning glories. Inside, Samantha's kitchen sprawled warm and inviting, with a long table that could seat 20 souls. Levi had crafted the furniture himself, each piece smooth and sturdy, built to last generations. On a crisp evening in late fall, lamplights spilled from every window as people gathered for supper. Children's laughter mixed with adult conversation as freedmen from the next county shared stories with Amish families. A group of travelers who'd stopped to water their horses found themselves invited to stay. Adding their own tales to the mix, the front door creaked open and conversation hushed as Ethan Miller stepped inside. His broad-brimmed hat came off slowly, deliberately, and he hung it on the wooden peg by the door. The gesture spoke volumes, a father's blessing without words. Samantha moved forward, her apron dusted with flour, and gestured to the head of the table. "Welcome, Father Miller," she said softly. She served him first, filling his plate with steaming stew and fresh bread. His weathered hands folded in silent prayer before he began to eat. Gradually, talk resumed around the table. An Amish woman shared her pickle recipe with a freedman's wife. Children traded biscuits and whispered secrets. Ethan remained quiet, but his eyes took in the scene, something softening in his stern face. As the meal progressed, old walls began to crumble. Ethan answered a question about crop rotation, then found himself drawn into a deeper discussion about Maya. And Maya scored my 7. I'll send her save at the deeper discussion about farming techniques. His voice, though still measured, carried no trace of its former coldness. When the dishes were cleared, someone started a hymn. Voices joined in harmony, plain song weaving with spiritual, creating something new and beautiful. The music filled every corner of the house, rising through the rafters like a prayer. Levi and Samantha slipped outside together, their fingers intertwined. Behind them, the farmhouse glowed like a lantern on the darkening prairie. Through the windows, they could see their gathered family, not by blood, but by choice and love, singing together in the lamplight. Samantha squeezed Levi's hand, her eyes bright with happy tears. They had built more than walls and a roof. They had created a haven where all were welcome, where old prejudices died and new understanding bloomed. The light from their windows reached out into the prairie darkness, a beacon promising warmth and fellowship to any who might pass by. Inside, the singing continued. Ethan's deep voice had joined the chorus, blending with Samantha's clear tones and Levi's steady baritone. The hymn spoke of love and redemption, of light overcoming darkness, a testimony in song to the power of open hearts and faithful spirits. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.